They say silence has a sound. Step into the wrong building at the wrong hour, and it becomes deafening, an almost physical pressure pressing against your chest, forcing your pulse into your ears until you can hear the truth you weren't supposed to hear. The abandoned children's hospital has that silence. It isn't just absence, it's presence. Your idea could be the next video. Subscribe today and comment your topic suggestion below. And please don't forget to mention your city and the time you're watching this video. The kind that makes you stop breathing because you swear something is listening, and history tells us something was. This building, erected under the banner of healing, became something else. Not just a place where children were treated, but where they were taken, into experiments, into silence, into disappearance. The state records are fragments, burned files, redacted pages, but the echoes remain. And once you step inside those halls, even now, you realize the walls themselves remember. The chipped paint is layered with screams. The beds that rot in corners still hold the shape of bodies that never left. The shadows in the stairwell know more about human cruelty than the textbooks ever will. But the horror isn't that children died here. No, death is merciful. The horror is that they lived, trapped inside cages disguised as wards, their lives reduced to test subjects in a machine that was never about healing. You see, institutions like this don't vanish because they failed. They vanish because someone succeeded too well. What if I told you that the hospital wasn't abandoned because of bankruptcy or war or fire, but because it had served its purpose? What if I told you the silence inside its walls is not accidental, but designed? You were never meant to know this. You were never meant to ask why dozens of children disappeared into this institution's dune and never walked out. You were never meant to discover why the state sealed its records, why clergy turned away, why parents who demanded answers were quietly erased from the conversation. And you were never meant to hear the truth that healing was never the point. The hospital was a mask, and behind that mask lies the oldest obsession of human power: control. So ask yourself this: when silence grows too heavy, when truth is buried so deep it's almost forgotten, why does it always find a way back? Why does the past claw its way out of locked archives, out of abandoned halls, to demand that you listen? Tonight, I'm taking you inside. But once you hear it, you cannot unhear. The hospital's story begins the way all great lies begin, under the illusion of benevolence. In the late 19th century, when industrial smoke blackened skies and cities overflowed with children who had no homes, no food, no chance, a sanctuary was announced. A children's hospital, funded by state money, endorsed by church leaders, praised by newspapers. They painted it as a triumph of progress, a beacon of mercy for the most vulnerable. But men who speak too loudly about mercy are always hiding something. The building was massive, too large for its purpose, its halls stretching longer than needed, its basements deeper than practical. From the beginning, it wasn't designed like a hospital. It was designed like a system. The wards were arranged in grids, not for comfort, but for containment. The windows were narrow slits, high above the ground, allowing little light and no escape. A man doesn't need a degree in architecture to see that this was never meant for healing. It was meant for control. Reports of overcrowding came almost immediately, yet admissions continued at double the facility's capacity. Children arrived by the dozens, some abandoned by families too poor to care for them, others taken by the state under accusations of neglect. Yet once inside, they were no longer children. They were numbers. Their names vanished from records, their files replaced by coded symbols. The institution claimed it was protecting them, but the truth was simple. Once you entered, you belonged to the system. And systems do not nurture, they consume. Rumors spread in the city that the hospital was experimenting with new treatments. that children were being kept in darkened rooms for days, that strange smells rose from the basement at night. The newspapers mocked such stories as superstition, dismissing them as the hysteria of grieving parents. But silence doesn't smother rumors, it feeds them. And when whispers begin in one neighborhood, then another, and then an entire county, you must ask, who is working so hard to make you stop asking questions? The hospital's directors were men of status, protected by politics, religion, and wealth. They shook hands with judges, dined with bishops, and signed checks that kept journalists obedient. Their wards were filled not just with the poor, but with the unwanted, children whose existence embarrassed the state, threatened families of influence, or revealed the hypocrisy of religious leaders. This wasn't a hospital. It was a vault for secrets, and children were the currency. And every system that deals in human currency eventually shows its hand. By the turn of the century, the hospital's silence had become more sinister, because silence in power is never passive, it is enforced. The doctors were not healers in the way the public imagined. They were gatekeepers of knowledge, men obsessed with studying the human mind and body under the most extreme conditions, and children were the perfect subjects, because who questions when the voiceless suffer? In the lower levels of the hospital, beneath the wards where sunlight could not reach, records describe experimental therapies, words that sound clinical until you understand they meant isolation tanks where infants were left in total darkness, electroshock administered to toddlers as tests of resilience, and crude surgeries without anesthetic under the guise of scientific progress. And yet, not a word reached the outside. Parents who demanded to see their children were told visitation was restricted, that disease outbreaks required strict isolation, that the health of all patients depended on obedience. The public believed it, because people always believe institutions draped in white coats and sanctified by priests. But behind those walls, children vanished, not into death certificates, not into cemeteries, but into nothingness. Names were erased, documents shredded, photographs burned. The ledger lists 1,000 admitted in a decade, but fewer than half ever discharged. Where did they go? The hospital claimed adoption, the orphanage claimed transfer, the church claimed God's will, and all three signed off on each other's lies. Here lies the pattern you were never meant to see. Institutions, when united, can hide anything. When the state, the church, and medicine clasp hands, the human being disappears. And the most terrifying thing? The hospital did not operate in the shadows. It stood in the open, its red brick walls looming over the city like a monument to me, Versailles. The truth was buried, not underground, but in plain sight, disguised by the power of belief. You see, corruption at its deepest level never screams. It whispers calmly, rationally, wearing the mask of virtue, and the people, desperate to believe in safety, accept the mask. They walk past the hospital's iron gates, nod at the nurses in their white uniforms, and never ask why the windows at the top floors are barred like a prison. They never ask why the hospital has its own incinerator burning at night. They never ask why children's laughter is never heard from the playground. They never ask, until it is too late. The first so-called investigation came not from courage, but from convenience, a response to whispers too loud to ignore, and yet it was designed from the start to bury the truth rather than reveal it. In 1907, a committee of state officials toured the children's hospital after a series of anonymous letters accused the institution of gross neglect and unspeakable practices. But what did they find? Exactly what they were meant to find. The directors prepared the wards days in advance, painting over rot, scrubbing blood from the walls, dressing half-starved children in clean clothes, and moving the worst cases to the basement where no inspector dared to wander. When the men in black coats entered, they saw smiling nurses, tidy beds, and rows of children rehearsed to recite thanks for their care. The committee signed their names to a report declaring the hospital a model of charity, and just like that, silence was sealed again. But the question is not why the investigation failed. The question is why it was allowed to happen at all. And the answer is chilling. Because someone in power wanted to measure the public's memory. They wanted to know if suspicion could be drowned in performance, if truth could be extinguished by theater. It worked. Newspapers printed photographs of officials shaking hands with hospital staff, headlines praising the shining example of Pennsylvania mercy. And those who dared to doubt were branded as liars, radicals, or lunatics. The system had learned something that day. If you control perception, you control reality. If you feed the public an image, you don't need to silence their questions because they stop asking them themselves. This is the darker lesson the hospital embodied, one that echoes into our time. Institutions don't erase history with force, they erase it with narrative. They do not burn all the files. They leave enough to appear whole, nest, while burying the rest in shadows so deep no one dares to dig. And what's most disturbing is that this wasn't a failure of oversight. It was proof of design, because every inspection afterward followed the same pattern, a dance of white coats, rehearsed children, and signed papers that locked the truth deeper into silence. The abandoned hospital stands today not because it was exposed, but because it was no longer needed. The experiment had already succeeded. Years after the hospital was shuttered, fragments of testimony began to surface, not from officials or clergy, but from the forgotten workers who had been trapped inside its machinery. Orderlies, janitors, kitchen staff, men and women who had no power while the hospital thrived, but who, in their old age, carried memories too heavy to take to the grave. One man described being ordered to carry crates late at night into the basement, crates that rattled with movement, though no sound escaped them. Another recalled the endless loads sent to the hospital incinerator, not of bedding or waste, but of bones small enough to belong only to children. A nurse who fled in silence later admitted that her duties included administering injections to quiet the wards before inspections, sedating dozens of children so they would appear calm, docile, and grateful when the officials walked through. She confessed that some never woke up. Each story was brushed aside as rumor, the rantings of the elderly or attempts to blackmail the state for compensation. But when the fragments are laid together, a pattern emerges too precise to dismiss. These weren't isolated acts of cruelty. They were rituals of control, carefully designed, systematically repeated, executed under the watch of men whose reputations were untouchable. And what is perhaps most terrifying is not what these workers described, but what they could not. None of them were allowed near the lowest sub-basement, the level sealed behind iron doors that only physicians and administrators entered. They spoke of strange odors, metallic and chemical, rising from vents in the floor. They recalled faint vibrations at night, as though machinery operated below, even when the hospital above was silent. The janitor who swept the halls for 20 years said he could never forget the smell of the elevator when it came up from the lower levels, an odor of charred hair, scorched fabric, and something else he refused to name. These testimonies, though disbelieved by courts and officials, carry the weight of a truth institutions could not erase. That the hospital was not abandoned because of decline, but because it had served its hidden purpose. Its directors disappeared into politics, medicine, and religious hierarchies, rewarded for their silence, promoted for their complicity. And the workers? They were left with memories they could never silence, nightmares that still bled into their final days. You see, the abandoned hospital is not empty. It is full of voices, of whispers, of testimonies no one wanted to hear. And if you listen closely enough, those voices are still speaking. The deeper one digs into the records of that era, the more a chilling pattern reveals itself. The hospital was not an anomaly, but part of a larger network of experiments hidden behind state funding and cloaked in the language of progress. Buried in archives in boxes marked confidential and archival only are memorandums exchanged between governors, bishops, and medical directors that reference pilot programs and controlled populations. These phrases were never meant to reach the public eye, but they betray a terrifying truth. Patients in the hospital were never viewed as human beings, but as test subjects, instruments in a broader scheme. Cross-referencing dates, one notices that each expansion of the hospital coincides with mysterious reports from neighboring towns, sudden disappearances of orphans, shipments of unidentified cadavers sent to universities, unexplained fires that destroyed county records. A wider investigation uncovers that similar facilities across the country operated under identical protocols, all closing abruptly within a narrow window of years, as if a master switch had been thrown. Survivors whisper of white-coated men traveling between institutions, never identified, never logged, but recognized by staff across state lines as inspectors. These men carried satchels of instruments, vials of unknown chemicals, and clipboards full of symbols that resembled no ordinary medical charts. The unsettling part is how all of this fits into a greater rhythm. Patients would vanish in waves, records would vanish in parallel, and then silence would follow, as if the institution itself exhaled relief after its harvest. The hospital was not just a local atrocity, but a cog in a machine designed to feed data, flesh, and silence into higher authorities whose motives were buried behind layers of charity, religion, and science. And when these facts, ILED shut down, the doctors scattered into positions of prestige, leading universities, advising governments, directing charities, all carrying the same knowledge they had cultivated in secrecy. What knowledge was so valuable it demanded silence purchased with lives? What discovery could have been worth sacrificing children to the flames of hidden laboratories? That is the question history still refuses to answer, because to answer it is to admit that progress itself has always been tainted by the blood of the forgotten. When the veil finally lifts, even slightly, what emerges is not a story of medicine at all, but of ritual masquerading as science, experiments conducted less to cure the body than to fracture the soul. Patients were not treated with therapies designed to restore them. They were submitted to cycles of deprivation, prolonged silence, sudden bursts of sensory overload, and rituals timed with lunar phases, all recorded with meticulous precision. The language of science provided cover, terms like neurological recalibration or limbic system stimulation. But beneath those sterile phrases lay techniques far older than the hospital's founding, practices eerily similar to descriptions of monastic punishments, medieval exorcisms, and initiation rites whispered about in secret societies. Survivors spoke of rooms with no windows, where individuals were placed in total darkness for days, then dragged into blindingly lit chambers filled with chanting nurses whose voices followed strict cadences more like liturgy than clinical instruction. Others remembered being made to sit in front of mirrors for hours, forced to repeat phrases that were not their own, phrases written on slips of paper in a script they could not read but somehow understood. These were not random cruelties. They were structured, orchestrated, as though the hospital itself was an instrument designed to dismantle identity and rebuild it according to some hidden blueprint. The evidence is in the hospital's architecture. Hallways that form near-perfect labyrinths, with turns that led back on themselves, staircases that looped in unsettling symmetry, and underground chambers positioned in alignment with celestial points rather than any logical foundation. To walk those halls was to walk inside a sigil, a symbol etched in brick and bone, where every step contributed to an experiment that was as much spiritual as it was physical. And this is where the unease sharpens, the realization that the hospital's true purpose was not healing, not even science as we know it, but the systematic unmaking of the human self, conducted with precision by men who believed they were unlocking something far older and far darker than medicine could ever reach. The mirror room was perhaps the most infamous of all the hospital's hidden chambers, a place so meticulously designed that anyone who entered lost track of themselves almost immediately. Walls covered in reflective glass from floor to ceiling, mirrors angled to create endless repetitions of the same small, terrified body. Children were placed inside for hours, sometimes days, with no interaction except for commands repeated over and over by the nurses, commands that had no meaning but demanded obedience. The effect was devastating. The mind, confronted with infinite reflections of itself, began to fracture. Survivors described seeing not one version of themselves, but dozens, sometimes hundreds, each moving independently, some mocking, some silent, some screaming silently. Time distorted. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into days, until reality became a hall of phantoms. When children were finally removed, if they survived, they were no longer the same. Their voices had changed, their mannerisms shifted, and in some cases, they no longer recognized their own names. The hospital's doctors recorded everything with clinical detachment, charts and diagrams noting reactions, endurance, and compliance, as if each child were a sample, a variable in an equation only they understood. The mirror room was not an isolated experiment, but part of a larger pattern, a network of chambers, schedules, and protocols designed to strip away identity systematically, to test the limits of obedience, fear, and memory. And while these procedures were described in the language of science, the underlying methodology was ritualistic, precise, and chillingly deliberate. The halls outside the mirror room remained deceptively quiet, but the echoes of those experiments lingered in every corridor, every staircase, every locked door. Those who worked in the hospital but never entered the mirror room claimed they could feel its presence, a kind of psychic vibration that unsettled both staff and patients. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the architects of these rituals were never content with their initial outcomes. They sought to refine, to perfect, to observe the threshold between compliance and rebellion, between fear and despair. Each experiment added a new layer to a system designed not merely to heal or punish, but to understand the very mechanics of the human soul under absolute control. The mirror room stands as a testament to that ambition, a room built not for life, not for recovery, but for transformation, and the cost of that transformation was measured in lost childhoods, fractured minds, and the silence that followed each cycle. The horror of the hospital did not end at its walls. Its influence seeped into the surrounding community like a slow, invisible poison. Families who had entrusted their children to the institution were monitored, their movements recorded, their questions subtly redirected or dismissed. Local authorities, teachers, and clergy, many of whom genuinely believed they were protecting children, were quietly co-opted into the system, either through threats, bribes, or carefully cultivated respect for the hospital's reputation. Parents who asked too many questions received polite but firm letters warning against interference with medical practice, or were reassured that the hospital knew best, that the children were in the hands of experts. Neighborhoods around the hospital began to adopt a peculiar quiet, a collective reluctance to discuss the institution openly. Children who returned from visits, if they returned at all, carried with them the same muted obedience, the same flickers of fear in their eyes, as if the influence of the hospital extended through mere presence. Rumors of disappearances were dismissed as imagination, hearsay, or divine misfortune. And yet, if one looked closer, a pattern emerged. Families who had resisted, who had demanded access, or tried to withdraw their children, experienced financial ruin, social ostracization, or legal complications that forced them to comply. It was a system built on both fear and belief, fear of authority, belief in benevolence, where each reinforced the other, creating a feedback loop of obedience that extended far beyond the hospital's iron gates. Teachers noticed children who returned from hospital programs exhibiting strange behaviors, regurgitating phrases they didn't understand, repeating rhythms of speech that made no sense to ordinary adults. Clergy reported confessions filled with coded language, children describing eames of rooms and mirrors they could never name. Even the local medical community, sworn to ethics and compassion, remained complicit, accepting the hospital's reports without question, impressed by its apparent efficiency and the veneer of scientific progress. And so the system endured, not because it was invisible, but because it was insidious, woven into daily life, into trust, into the very institutions people relied upon to protect innocence. The hospital taught a terrifying lesson. Power, when combined with secrecy, ritual, and the complicity of the many, can remake a community itself into an instrument of control, one that spreads far beyond the building that started it all. The children who lived or survived the hospital were subjected to psychological manipulation so precise and relentless that they ceased to be independent agents of thought, becoming instead extensions of the institution itself. Fear was calibrated with care, delivered in measured doses to maintain obedience without breaking the body entirely. Rewards were dispensed sparingly, reinforcing behavior that conformed to the hospital's strict rules, while punishment was omnipresent, unpredictable, and often invisible. Some were isolated for days, sometimes weeks, with only the sound of their own breathing to anchor them to reality, teaching the mind that companionship was both fleeting and conditional. Others were forced into repetitive tasks, meaningless chores that seemed trivial but subtly dismantled initiative, eroding the natural curiosity that separates thought from indoctrination. Language itself became a tool of control. Phrases repeated in strict cadence, questions answered with pre-approved responses, every utterance observed and catalogued. Mirrors, lights, and shadows were used not just for observation, but as instruments of disorientation, conditioning the children to doubt their perceptions and their memory. Over time, identity itself began to fracture. Children stopped thinking of themselves as individuals and began to internalize the patterns, hierarchies, and expectations imposed upon them. Even laughter and tears were monitored, evaluated for signs of deviation, and corrected with silent threats or prolonged confinement. This was not merely training, it was the systematic stripping away of autonomy, teaching obedience as the highest virtue and defiance as the ultimate danger. And the architects of this system knew that once the mind had been molded in these halls, it would carry the lessons far beyond the building itself, infecting behavior, choices, and loyalties for years, even decades. By mastering the psyche of the young, the hospital ensured that its influence would persist long after the bricks had crumbled, long after the doors were locked, and long after the world outside had forgotten it existed. The children, once liberated from the building, did not return to innocence. They returned as living reminders of the institution's reach, its mastery over body, mind, and spirit, the silent testimony of a system designed to consume and control. Escape attempts were few, but when they occurred, they were met with consequences so severe that they became whispered warnings among the children, etched into memory like invisible scars. One boy, no older than 10, tried to slip through a side door during a brief moment when a nurse's attention faltered. He made it only halfway down the corridor before the alarm system, a network of bells, lights, and hidden observers, was triggered. By the time anyone reached him, he was no longer the same child who had dared to run. Staff later reported that he had been subjected to corrective isolation, a euphemism for days spent in darkness with only the echo of his own voice for company. When he emerged, he refused to speak of what had happened, his eyes vacant, his body trembling, as if the very act of attempting freedom had rewritten his mind. Others tried similar feats, only to vanish entirely, their disappearances explained away by bureaucratic excuses or sudden medical transfers. Even the smallest acts of rebellion were catalogued and studied, the reactions of the children carefully recorded to refine future psychological conditioning. The system was self-correcting. The institution learned from each attempt, adjusting schedules, staff rotations, and the placement of observation mirrors to eliminate weaknesses. Escape became not just a physical impossibility, but a mental impossibility. The children learned, through terror and repetition, that running meant more than danger. It meant erasure. And while the public remained unaware, the hospital's directors celebrated these failures as proof of the efficacy of their design, a perverse metric of success that measured obedience in the units of fear and compliance. Each thwarted escape served to reinforce the invisible architecture of control, both within the building and in the psyche of every child who remained, teaching them that liberty was an illusion, that every thought and impulse could be monitored, analyzed, and redirected. In that way, the hospital created something more terrifying than imprisonment. It created a population that had internalized its own captivity, a silent army of witnesses who could never speak without betraying the institution's power. A living proof that the most effective prisons are not built with stone and iron, but with fear, routine, and meticulously engineered compliance. The staff of the hospital occupied a position both enviable and cursed. They were the gatekeepers of control, the architects of fear, yet themselves bound by a web of complicity that demanded silence and obedience. Nurses, orderlies, and aides were trained not just in medical procedures, but in the subtle art of psychological manipulation, taught how to read body language, anticipate rebellion, and apply both reward and punishment with exacting precision. Promotions and recognition were tied directly to the successful conditioning of the children, creating an internal incentive system that aligned ambition with cruelty. Those who questioned the morality of their work were quietly reassigned, dismissed, or coaxed into compliance through a combination of fear and prestige. Few lasted long enough to resist. The hierarchy was rigid. Directors and physicians sat above, issuing protocols that were executed without deviation, while senior nurses supervised the lower staff, ensuring that each layer reinforced the obedience of the one beneath it. Staff were taught to view the children not as individuals, but as instruments, variables in an experiment whose outcomes were prized above empathy, above conscience. Letters, diaries, and secret memoirs recovered decades later reveal the cognitive dissonance required to survive in such an environment. The rationalizations, the justifications, the stories they told themselves to sleep at night. Some described a creeping sense of pride, a belief that they were part of something greater, that the institution's purpose justified any moral compromise. Others lived in constant anxiety, haunted by the cries that lingered in memory, by the sight of vacant eyes and trembling limbs, knowing that any lapse could endanger not just the children, but themselves. The staff became both enforcers and victims, complicit in crimes they would never publicly admit, yet irrevocably shaped by the system that demanded their obedience. And perhaps the most insidious aspect of all was how this culture of compliance extended beyond the hospital walls. These individuals carried their lessons into other institutions, into families, into communities, spreading patterns of control, surveillance, and silent domination. In this way, the hospital's legacy was not confined to abandoned halls. It infected the very social fabric around it, demonstrating that power is not simply exercised through authority, but through the careful orchestration of complicity, the quiet shaping of minds to serve a hidden purpose. Beneath the hospital, hidden behind false walls and locked doors that were never listed in any blueprint, lay a cache of records so meticulously kept that they constituted the institution's most damning evidence. Rows of filing cabinets, shelves stacked with bound ledgers, and meticulously labeled boxes contained decades of observations, charts, and coded notes detailing the minutiae of every patient's behavior, every psychological test, every act of compliance or defiance. These were not casual medical records. They were chronicles of control, documenting the progression of fear, obedience, and identity erosion with chilling precision. Every experiment, every ritual, every solitary confinement session was logged with timestamps, annotations, and evaluations of effectiveness. Notes in the margins, scribbled in haste or in code, reveal a system obsessed with optimization. How long a child could endure sensory deprivation, how many repetitions of a command could break resistance, how mirror exposure altered perception of self, how whispered instructions reshaped thought patterns over weeks and months. The codex also contained diagrams of hidden chambers, architectural blueprints that were later altered in official records to obscure their true purpose, and lists of staff rotations aligned with the timing of specific manipulations, ensuring that every action was orchestrated with precision. What is most disturbing is the level of foresight and cold calculation evident in these documents. The directors were not simply cruel, they were methodical, treating human life as data points to be measured, adjusted, and refined. When investigators finally stumbled upon fragments of these archives decades later, the realization struck that the hospital was not a series of improvised abuses, but a carefully designed laboratory of control, where every room, every hallway, every staff agent was intended to produce a specific psychological outcome. The records themselves, though yellowed and decayed, conveyed a voice of reason and pride, a chilling testament to how bureaucracy, science, and secrecy can converge to create horrors that endure far longer than the physical institution. And even now, long after the hospital was abandoned, these hidden records whisper a warning. The machinery of control, once perfected, can leave traces that haunt generations, shaping minds and institutions long after the walls have crumbled. The horror of the hospital was amplified by the complicity of those who were supposed to safeguard morality and law. Government officials, clergy, and medical boards who turned a blind eye or actively facilitated the system of abuse. Correspondence recovered decades later reveals a pattern of discreet approvals, vague inspections, and bureaucratic delays that ensured the hospital operated without interference. Reports of missing children, irregular medical practices, and staff misconduct were filed, shuffled, and quietly archived, often accompanied by notes urging discretion for the greater good of public trust. Religious leaders, who had once championed the hospital as a haven for orphans and the sick, were quietly reassured that strict oversight was in place, that the institution adhered to divine and scientific principles alike. Yet their letters reveal unease, questions of conscience that were brushed aside or pacified with donations, titles, and the promise of institutional prestige. Government agencies, too, acted more as facilitators than regulators, funding expansions, approving experiments under the guise of public health, and dismissing complaints as anecdotal or exaggerated. In every case, the same subtle mechanisms were at work. Authority cloaked in trust, secrecy enforced through hierarchy, and accountability diluted by layers of bureaucracy. The result was a system in which cruelty could flourish, not through chaos, but through order, shielded by the very institutions society believed were guardians of welfare. The hospital thrived not only because of its internal mechanisms of control, but because those outside saw only its outward facade, brick walls, official seals, and carefully crafted reports, while the machinery of manipulation ran undisturbed within. And perhaps the most insidious aspect of all was that this complicity created a culture of responsibility and denial, a network of people who could never speak without implicating themselves, ensuring silence even when conscience demanded disclosure. It became apparent that the horrors of the hospital were not the product of rogue actors, but of an entire ecosystem designed to obscure, justify, and perpetuate control, revealing that corruption and manipulation at the highest levels are what allow true evil to persist unnoticed. The children who emerged from the hospital were often hollowed versions of themselves, their identities permanently fractured, their behaviors altered in ways that would haunt them, and anyone who tried to help them, for the rest of their lives. Some could no longer form attachments. Trust had been stripped so thoroughly that even familiar faces provoked anxiety or withdrawal. Others exhibited compulsive behaviors, repeating phrases or movements learned under duress, echoes of commands drilled into them as part of the hospital's experiments. Memory itself was warped. They recalled events in fragments, or as if they belonged to someone else, and could not distinguish between what had truly happened and what the staff had imposed upon them. Survivors who reached adulthood reported a constant underlying sense of surveillance, as if the institution still watched them, monitoring compliance long after their release. Careers, relationships, and personal ambitions were shaped, or in some cases destroyed, by the invisible residue of control implanted in those early years. Families who attempted to reintegrate their children found themselves navigating erratic behavior, inexplicable fears, and silent, unspoken traumas that resisted every attempt at healing. Psychologists studying these cases decades later documented a constellation of symptoms now recognized as complex PTSD, yet the hospital's records revealed that these outcomes were anticipated, predicted, and measured as part of an overarching experiment. What is most horrifying is the deliberate nature of the transformation. The goal was not mere obedience within the walls, but the creation of subjects who carried the institution's influence into the wider world, whose very thoughts, reactions, and decisions were subtly aligned with its hidden imperatives. These children, once freed, became living legacies of manipulation. Proof that the most devastating power is not physical, but psychological, the ability to reshape perception, allegiance, and identity with precision and patience. And for those who study the hospital today, there is an undeniable, terrifying lesson. Evil that is methodical, patient, and concealed within systems of trust does not vanish when the building falls. It endures in the minds of its victims, echoing across generations, an invisible architecture of control that can never truly be dismantled. Decades after the hospital was abandoned, explorers, historians, and a few brave journalists began to uncover its hidden chambers, each discovery more disturbing than the last, revealing horrors that even the staff had never fully comprehended. Behind false walls, beneath trapdoors, and under layers of flooring, they found rooms lined with instruments of psychological torment, chairs with restraints, mirror-lined cells, soundproofed isolation cubicles, and mechanisms designed to manipulate light, shadow, and temperature to disorient and terrorize. Detailed journals, written in codes and shorthand, described experiments in controlling perception, conditioning obedience, and fragmenting identity with a precision that suggested years of refinement and iteration. In some chambers, skeletal remains and personal effects of children were discovered, carefully catalogued as if part of the experiment's data rather than the aftermath of violence. Diaries of staff revealed their ignorance of the full extent of the operations. Even those who administered the routines were sometimes unaware of how far-reaching and meticulously orchestrated the system had become. Maps hidden behind panels illustrated a labyrinthine network of corridors and observation points, allowing directors to monitor and influence every action in real time. The psychological sophistication embedded in these spaces was staggering. Sounds, reflections, and forced routines were combined to create environments where children could not trust their senses, where every thought was guided, every reaction anticipated. What investigators realized was that the hospital was not merely a site of abuse, it was an entire ecosystem of control, a machine designed to engineer obedience and fear with near-perfect efficiency. And as they pieced together the extent of these hidden chambers, the chilling truth emerged. The hospital's architects had succeeded not only in breaking children within its walls, but in creating a methodology for shaping human behavior that could, theoretically, be applied anywhere. The remnants of these chambers serve as a silent testament, a warning etched into concrete and steel. Systems of absolute control, once perfected, can endure far beyond their creators, leaving traces of domination that echo in the minds of the innocent, long after the doors are locked and the world has forgotten. Among the most insidious revelations were the hospital's experiments in memory erasure and forced obedience, techniques that went far beyond punishment and entered the realm of systematic identity reconstruction. Children were subjected to repeated cycles of disorientation, exposure to conflicting instructions, and sensory manipulation designed to sever connections between past experiences and present awareness. Names, personal histories, and familial ties were stripped away in carefully orchestrated stages, replaced with arbitrary rules, phrases, or coded behaviors that the staff monitored relentlessly. Even the simplest act of choice, what to eat, what to wear, or where to sit, was conditioned, observed, and corrected to reinforce submission. The hospital utilized mirrors, shadows, and controlled lighting to distort reality, making children doubt their own perceptions and memories, instilling a sense that nothing outside the hospital could be trusted. Periods of isolation were coupled with subtle psychological triggers, songs, scents, or gestures that became commands, reinforcing obedience long after the immediate punishment ended. Staff journals noted the efficacy of these methods with clinical detachment, celebrating moments when a child, previously resistant, could be led to repeat entire sequences of behavior without hesitation. Those who resisted for too long faced intensified interventions, extended isolation, sensory deprivation, or relocation to chambers designed to break both mind and body. By the time children emerged from these cycles, their personalities had been fragmented, their natural impulses overridden, and their very sense of self subordinated to the institution's will. It was a calculated transformation, one that ensured the hospital's influence extended far beyond its walls, with survivors carrying invisible chains that dictated perception, loyalty, and behavior for decades. This was not merely abuse, it was the deliberate creation of living instruments, proof that psychological architecture once mastered could bend the human mind to a purpose entirely divorced from morality. And as investigators later pieced together these methods, it became terrifyingly clear that the hospital had not only altered lives, but demonstrated a blueprint for total control, a dark design that could be replicated wherever secrecy and authority converged. The reach of the hospital extended far beyond its walls, seeping into the surrounding community in ways that were subtle, systemic, and insidiously effective, reshaping social behaviors and expectations without the public ever realizing it. Families who lived near the institution became unwitting participants in its methods of control, observing strange routines, reporting missing children, or interacting with staff who had internalized the hospital's ideology of obedience and surveillance. Teachers, local business owners, and clergy, some of whom had children under their care, began to mirror the practices learned from the hospital's staff: rigid discipline, unquestioned authority, and an unspoken expectation of conformity. Patterns of fear and submission trickled down generationally, not through overt violence, but through the normalization of surveillance, control, and secrecy as acceptable tools for managing behavior. Parents unknowingly adopted the same methods, correcting minor defiance with disproportionate authority, rewarding compliance selectively, and fostering a climate of self-policing among children, effectively extending the hospital's psychological reach into private homes. Local governance and law enforcement, having long accepted the hospital as a legitimate institution, lent tacit approval to these practices, reinforcing the message that control and obedience were both necessary and virtuous. Even decades after the hospital's closure, its influence lingered in cultural norms, in the way authority was respected without question, in the acceptance of rigid hierarchies, and in the pervasive anxiety that hovered over community life like a silent shadow. Scholars studying these patterns noted the horrifying efficiency of such systemic contamination. An institution that could manipulate a few hundred children within its walls had left an imprint on thousands of adults, shaping behaviors, fears, and loyalties without leaving a single overt trace. The hospital had not merely inflicted harm on those within. It had engineered a psychological contagion, a blueprint for control that spread outward, demonstrating that true power does not rely solely on force, but on the subtle, persistent shaping of minds across generations. When survivors of the hospital first returned to confront its ruins, their experiences revealed a depth of trauma and manipulation that had been carefully hidden even from themselves for decades. Walking through the crumbling corridors, they were flooded with fragmented memories, snatches of shadowed hallways, the echo of distant commands, flashes of rooms that seemed both familiar and alien. Some recalled specific chambers, once hidden behind false walls, where they had been subjected to procedures designed to erase identity, and the visceral terror returned with astonishing clarity, as if the building itself had etched their experiences into the very air. Others discovered physical remnants of the hospital's hidden experiments, coded journals, rusted implements of control, and boxes containing personal effects catalogued with obsessive detail. The survivors began piecing together the reality of what had been done to them, realizing that their lives had been shaped not by chance or cruelty alone, but by a deliberate, systematic manipulation of mind, body, and perception. Many described an almost metaphysical sense of presence, as if the institution continued to observe them, a psychological imprint left by years of conditioning that no time or distance could erase. Interviews, diaries, and recorded testimonies revealed that even their own families had unknowingly reinforced behaviors instilled by the hospital, completing cycles of control that extended into adulthood. These confrontations with the physical space, the hidden records, and their own memories catalyzed a profound, often terrifying awareness. The institution's power had not ended with its closure. It had become internalized, a lingering architecture of control residing within the survivors themselves. The act of facing the hospital's ruins was more than a journey into the past. It was a reckoning with the invisible chains that had been forged in childhood, a confrontation with the truth that the most enduring prisons are not built of stone, but of mind and memory. One of the most insidious tools the hospital employed to enforce obedience and erase identity was the use of symbolic rituals and coded language, a system so pervasive that children absorbed its rules before they even understood speech. Each day began and ended with structured routines that were deceptively simple: commands to align shoes, fold blankets, recite phrases in unvarying cadence. But these were imbued with hidden meaning, serving as exercises in absolute compliance. Colors, shapes, and objects were assigned significance. A red ribbon could signify approval. A misplaced book could trigger punishment. Words themselves were stripped of ordinary meaning and transformed into triggers for behavior. A seemingly innocuous phrase could instill fear, reinforce submission, or erase a memory of an earlier event. The children internalized these cues, reacting instinctively to patterns and symbols rather than conscious choice, creating a psychological architecture in which the hospital's authority existed at a level below awareness. Even when separated from the institution, survivors found that these triggers could resurface unexpectedly. An accidental repetition of a phrase, a familiar sound, or a visual cue could provoke anxiety, compliance, or dissociation, evidence that the conditioning had become a permanent part of their cognitive framework. Staff records reveal that the hospital meticulously tracked which symbols and phrases were most effective, refining their system over decades with near-scientific precision, and noting in journals when a child resisted or deviated, documenting interventions to reinforce the desired response. The use of symbolic language was more than a method of control. It was a mechanism for rewriting identity, creating an internalized obedience so complete that the institution's influence persisted even after the body left the premises. This discovery, when first documented by later investigators, revealed a truth more chilling than physical abuse. The hospital had not only inflicted immediate suffering, but had designed a cognitive system capable of bending human thought itself, proving that domination need not be visible to be absolute, and that control over symbols and language can become control over the self. The hospital's operations were shrouded not only in secrecy, but in the veneer of scientific legitimacy, exploiting the emerging psychiatric theories of the 19th and early 20th centuries to justify and conceal its atrocities. Directors and senior staff aligned their methods with contemporary ideas of mental hygiene, obedience conditioning, and developmental psychology, presenting their work as research aimed at understanding and correcting deficiencies in vulnerable children. They cited medical texts, corresponded with prominent psychiatrists, and published carefully edited reports that framed brutal interventions as experimental treatments or preventative measures. These affiliations provided a shield against scrutiny, allowing systemic abuse to be reframed as progressive science, while outsiders, doctors, social reformers, and government inspectors often nodded in agreement, assuming that the institution adhered to accepted ethical norms. In reality, the hospital selectively borrowed language and theory, applying it to practices that were deliberately cruel, manipulative, and psychologically devastating. Children were labeled with clinical diagnoses that were intentionally vague, allowing virtually any behavior to be interpreted as confirmation of disorder, while the treatments were exercises in control, isolation, and obedience. Staff used the authority of these emerging disciplines to rationalize actions that were otherwise indefensible, creating a culture where ethical boundaries were blurred and dissent was silenced by appeals to science. Documents later discovered reveal meticulous correlations between theoretical principles and the hospital's methods, as if the institution had reverse-engineered academic ideas to create a laboratory of domination. By intertwining abuse with psychiatric legitimacy, the hospital achieved a dual victory: the outward appearance of moral and scientific authority, and the inward consolidation of absolute psychological control. The lessons for investigators were chilling. When ideology, authority, and secrecy converge, cruelty can be normalized, masked as progress, and left unchallenged for decades, proving that the most dangerous systems are those that cloak manipulation in the guise of knowledge and expertise. Families who sent their children to the hospital, believing they were placing them in safe care, became unwitting participants in the institution's system of control, reinforcing behaviors and expectations that extended the hospital's influence far beyond its walls. Letters from parents, now archived, show that many were manipulated through fear, guilt, or the promise of improvement, coaxed into praising routines and reporting compliance, thereby validating the hospital's methods. Instructions delivered to homes on diet, hygiene, and discipline mirrored the conditioning within the hospital, ensuring that children's behaviors remained aligned with the institution's goals even outside its immediate environment. Parents who questioned the practices were met with professional authority, warnings of the child's fragility, or subtle threats that non-compliance could reverse progress, creating a climate of silent complicity rooted in love and trust, twisted into submission. Families unknowingly reinforced the hospital's symbolic systems, repeating phrases, correcting gestures, and perpetuating rituals that the children had learned under duress, extending the psychological architecture of obedience into daily life. Letters and reports reveal the meticulous coordination between staff and families, a hidden network in which compliance was cultivated both inside and outside the institution, and where resistance could be subtly punished without detection. Survivors would later recall that their parents, far from being malevolent, became instruments of the very control that had shaped their early identities, illustrating the terrifying reach of a system that did not rely solely on overt force. This dynamic underscores a profound truth. Control becomes far more insidious when it enlists allies who believe they are acting in good faith, transforming love, care, and social bonds into conduits for manipulation. The hospital's genius and its horror lay in this ability to extend its dominion invisibly, embedding obedience and altered identity into the very structures of family and community, so that the institution's influence persisted even as its walls decayed and its directors faded into history. The hospital maintained its grip through an intricate system of coded communication and secret rituals, a language known only to staff and carefully monitored children designed to enforce obedience, conceal misconduct, and perpetuate fear. Every gesture, phrase, and minor action could carry hidden meaning. A tilt of the head signaled approval or warning, a repeated word triggered compliance, and objects placed in precise arrangements reinforced hierarchy and submission. Staff communicated through subtle cues during daily routines, ensuring that surveillance was constant yet invisible, that discipline could be administered without attracting the attention of outsiders. These rituals were not merely procedural, they were performative, embedding the hospital's authority into the very rhythm of life, teaching children that control was omnipresent, inescapable, and absolute. New staff were indoctrinated slowly, observing the rituals and learning the coded language, their initiation marked by silent tests of loyalty, obedience, and discretion, creating a network of complicity that extended the institution's reach. Investigators decades later noted that even minor deviations from these codes could trigger intense corrective measures, demonstrating the precision with which behavior was monitored and shaped. The hospital had essentially created a parallel culture, one in which meaning was layered, obedience was rewarded, and deviation could be punished silently, invisibly, yet ruthlessly. Through these systems, authority became internalized, with children learning not just to follow instructions, but to anticipate and regulate their own behavior according to unseen rules, a psychological conditioning that persisted long after their departure. The genius and terror of this design lay in its subtlety, power that was felt rather than seen, control exercised through symbols, patterns, and rituals, embedding compliance in the mind itself. This was not mere administration. It was the construction of a totalizing environment, a hidden architecture of influence that rendered freedom a distant, almost inconceivable concept, and proved that domination is far more effective when invisibly woven into the fabric of daily existence. Social isolation and peer-enforced compliance became central instruments of control within the hospital, a system designed to fracture natural bonds and replace them with fear-driven hierarchies dictated by the institution. Children were deliberately separated from siblings, friends, and familiar faces, placed into small, shifting groups where trust was nearly impossible to establish. Rivalries, suspicion, and enforced reporting of perceived disobedience turned peers into instruments of surveillance, ensuring that any lapse in behavior was immediately noted and punished, often publicly, so that compliance became both a personal and social imperative. Those who resisted were ostracized, subjected to heightened scrutiny, or placed in solitary confinement, creating a culture where fear of peer judgment reinforced the institution's authority more efficiently than staff intervention alone. Over time, children internalized this system, policing not only others' behavior but their own, constantly anticipating consequences and suppressing impulses that might provoke disapproval. The hospital leveraged natural human tendencies, loyalty, fear, and the need for social acceptance, transforming them into mechanisms of control, ensuring that obedience was maintained even in the absence of direct oversight. Journals recovered from staff show meticulous documentation of these interactions, noting how quickly children learned to monitor one another, how minor infractions were escalated through peer reporting, and how compliance could be extended indefinitely by manipulating social bonds. Survivors would later recount that the most enduring trauma came not from physical punishment, but from the relentless pressure to conform, the constant surveillance, and the betrayal implicit in friendships turned into instruments of control. The hospital had engineered a society within its walls, a macrocosm of domination in which hierarchy, fear, and conformity were self-reinforcing, proving that psychological control, when codified into social structures, could become nearly invisible yet nearly omnipotent, shaping behavior and identity with precision that would haunt the children long after they left. The hospital's manipulation extended deep into memory and personal narrative, systematically erasing individuality while instilling a rigid loyalty to the institution itself, creating a psychological framework in which identity was inseparable from obedience. Personal histories were stripped away through repetitive routines, punishment for recalling past experiences, and constant redirection toward hospital-sanctioned behaviors and recollections. Children were forced to recite approved stories about themselves and their actions, while deviations, whether remembering a family member, a home, or a private thought, were met with subtle punishment or isolation, gradually weakening the connection to their own past. Objects, photographs, and personal mementos were removed or destroyed, and interactions with outsiders were limited, reinforcing the notion that life outside the institution was irrelevant or dangerous. Over time, the children's sense of self became interwoven with the hospital's identity, their memories and choices subordinated to a framework constructed entirely by the directors and staff. Investigators found records detailing the deliberate timing and sequencing of interventions, calibrated to break resistance while fostering dependence, and the use of coded phrases and symbols to reinforce the idea that the institution's narrative was the only valid reality. Even after leaving, survivors described recurring compulsion to obey internalized rules, reliving rituals and responding to cues implanted decades earlier, proof that the hospital had succeeded in creating lifelong behavioral conditioning. The erasure of individuality was both psychological and existential, a meticulous recalibration of identity that rendered autonomy fragile and self-trust tenuous. In essence, the institution did not merely dominate behavior. It reconstructed the mind, shaping how children perceived themselves, their history, and their capacity for choice. This methodical re-engineering revealed a terrifying truth. Systems designed to control memory and narrative can extend their influence far beyond physical confinement, embedding obedience, fear, and institutional loyalty within the very architecture of the self, ensuring that the power of the hospital endured invisibly, silently, and indefinitely. The physical architecture of the hospital itself was a calculated instrument of psychological control, deliberately designed to disorient spatial perception and reinforce dependency on the institution and its staff. Corridors twisted unpredictably, doors led to unexpected rooms, and familiar spaces were subtly altered daily, creating an environment in which children could never rely on memory alone to navigate. Staircases were asymmetrical, hallways mirrored, and furniture rearranged in ways that undermined orientation, ensuring that children became acutely aware that their safety and direction depended entirely on guidance from staff. Even the smallest alterations, a missing sign, a shifted chair, or a blocked window, were integrated into a broader system of manipulation, teaching children that the world outside the hospital's control was unknowable, chaotic, and dangerous. Investigators later noted that this spatial disorientation compounded the effects of memory manipulation, symbolic conditioning, and social isolation, making the institution an all-encompassing environment where compliance was the only path to predictability and perceived security. Staff records reveal meticulous planning of these modifications, with notes correlating disorientation techniques to behavioral responses, tracking how children became more reliant on staff for movement, decisions, and understanding of their surroundings. Over time, children internalize this dependency, responding instinctively to the hospital's cues, anticipating staff expectations, and rarely questioning instructions because the external world had been reframed as incomprehensible and threatening. This architectural control was subtle yet absolute, a form of domination that bypassed conscious awareness, embedding obedience and submission directly into the body's spatial awareness and the mind's sense of certainty. In this way, the hospital's physical design became inseparable from its psychological methods, proving that domination can be engineered not only through punishment or instruction, but through the very environment in which a mind must function, rendering freedom an almost inconceivable state, both inside and long after leaving its walls. Hidden documentation and coded journals left behind by hospital staff provided a chilling testament to the scale, precision, and premeditation of the institution's experiments, revealing layers of control and manipulation that had remained invisible for decades. These records, often buried in false compartments or disguised as mundane ledgers, detailed every aspect of daily routines, behavioral responses, medical interventions, and the effects of symbolic and spatial conditioning on children over years and even decades. Staff meticulously noted which rituals provoked compliance, which phrases induced fear or submission, and how isolation and peer surveillance interacted to reinforce obedience. Some journals contained cryptic diagrams, coded annotations, and lists of children's names alongside behavioral scores, reflecting an almost obsessive monitoring of personality, memory retention, and emotional responses. Investigators who later deciphered these codes were confronted with the calculated methodology behind what survivors had long described as chaos or cruelty. Patterns emerged, showing that each intervention was designed with foresight, testing the boundaries of endurance, cognition, and loyalty. In some cases, the journals revealed explicit intentions to erase individuality, instill institutional dependence, and measure the permanence of psychological conditioning, making the hospital a laboratory of domination disguised as care. Beyond psychological experiments, the documents also recorded the manipulation of families, the calibration of social hierarchies among children, and the strategic use of fear to create predictably obedient behavior. These records proved that the hospital's influence was never accidental. It was meticulously engineered, monitored, and refined, demonstrating a terrifyingly systematic approach to shaping human identity. The sheer thoroughness of the documentation underscored a truth too often overlooked. The most effective forms of control do not rely solely on visible force or brutality, but on careful observation, data-driven strategies, and the subtle orchestration of fear, loyalty, and memory, leaving a legacy that endured long after the institution's physical decay. Survivor testimonies of coded punishments revealed a level of psychological cruelty so precise it bordered on scientific experimentation, showing how deeply the hospital's influence had permeated their development and perception of the world. Children who disobeyed or failed to anticipate expectations were subjected to punishments that were often invisible to outsiders. Subtle gestures, withheld rewards, or ritualized public shaming, carefully calibrated to provoke fear and reinforce vigilance. Many recalled being made to perform repetitive tasks under scrutiny, or to endure prolonged silence and isolation, with the rules shifting subtly to ensure confusion and uncertainty. What made these punishments so effective was that they were internalized. Children quickly learned to anticipate consequences, policing their own thoughts and actions to avoid error, effectively becoming agents of their own subjugation. Survivors described lingering responses well into adulthood, an instinctive hesitation to speak, a compulsion to follow perceived orders, or anxiety triggered by symbols and phrases once embedded in the hospital's conditioning. Some recounted recurring dreams of corridors, rooms, and rituals, memories resurfacing as vivid as the original experiences, proving that the psychological architecture of control had been etched permanently into their consciousness. These testimonies also illuminated the interplay between fear and dependency. The children, cut off from familiar support, came to equate obedience with safety, internalizing the institution's authority as an inescapable truth. Researchers examining these accounts recognized a pattern of learned helplessness, trauma bonding, and identity reshaping so systematic that it suggested an understanding of human psychology far beyond the ethical norms of the time. The hospital's methodology had succeeded in creating not mere Eli-compliant children, but individuals whose very perception of freedom, safety, and self was entwined with the legacy of control, demonstrating that power exercised through subtle, coded punishment can be far more enduring and insidious than overt violence, leaving scars that span a lifetime and, in some cases, generations. The hospital's final and most hidden experiments were executed with a level of secrecy that bordered on the criminally ingenious, designed to evade inspectors, reformers, and even the occasional parent who dared to question protocols. Entire wings were sealed from view, their existence unrecorded in official plans, accessible only to senior staff and select caretakers who had sworn absolute loyalty. Within these hidden spaces, children were subjected to prolonged isolation, sensory manipulation, and exposure to highly controlled stressors, techniques that tested endurance, obedience, and the limits of psychological resilience. Investigators who later gained access to these areas described rooms with distorted lighting, enclosed spaces that played with sound and shadow, and objects arranged to provoke specific emotional or cognitive responses. All movements were logged meticulously. Every child's reaction was recorded in coded journals, creating longitudinal studies of behavioral compliance and identity erosion that were decades ahead of contemporary psychological science. Staff notes reveal intentional layering of trauma, combining social, spatial, and symbolic manipulation to study cumulative effects on memory, loyalty, and self-concept, ensuring that the institution's grip extended far beyond immediate observation. These experiments were justified internally as necessary for the betterment or training of the children, a chilling reflection of how ideology, authority, and secrecy can warp morality and normalize cruelty. The lengths taken to conceal these practices from oversight reveal a calculated understanding of human institutions. The hospital recognized that its work would be condemned if fully visible, and so it created a dual reality, one for the public where charity and care were presented, and another for insiders where domination and control were perfect. With clinical precision. The discovery of these hidden experiments decades later forced historians and psychologists alike to confront the terrifying reality that systems of authority, when unaccountable and ideologically justified, can inflict harm with deliberate foresight, leaving survivors with lifelong psychological chains that extend long after the physical walls have crumbled. After the hospital's closure, post-investigation efforts peeled back layers of deception, revealing a sprawling network of influence that extended far beyond the crumbling walls, touching families, medical professionals, and local authorities who had unknowingly participated in its perpetuation. Official records, personal letters, and testimonies converged to paint a picture of an institution whose reach had infiltrated the social, bureaucratic, and psychological frameworks of the region. Families who had sent children in good faith were found to have been subtly complicit, conditioned through trust, fear, and misdirection to reinforce the hospital's authority and conceal its methods. Medical and psychiatric professionals, some directly consulted by the hospital and others relying on its reports, unknowingly validated abusive practices under the guise of research or treatment, lending credibility to interventions that were in fact instruments of psychological domination. Even local officials who inspected the facility were often presented with carefully staged appearances, selective tours, and falsified records, creating an illusion of compliance and propriety. The investigations revealed how systemic corruption, ideological justification, and a culture of secrecy allowed cruelty to persist unchecked, leaving survivors with trauma that the wider community could neither comprehend nor address. Scholars who later analyzed the hospital's documents and survivor accounts recognized a chilling pattern. The institution had effectively created an ecosystem of control where authority was diffused, compliance enforced indirectly, and accountability rendered impossible. Its long-term influence was profound, shaping the psychological, social, and cultural environment for decades, teaching harsh lessons about the capacity for power to operate invisibly, normalize abuse, and exploit it. Trust. The post-closure investigations expose the terrifying truth that some systems of domination are engineered not only to survive scrutiny, but to extend their impact indefinitely, demonstrating that the consequences of unchecked authority can ripple across time, leaving psychological scars and moral questions that generations must grapple with. The legacy of the hospital continues to reverberate in modern institutions, often hidden beneath layers of regulation, protocol, and professional authority, where subtle mechanisms of control echo the psychological architecture first perfected within its walls. Scholars and psychologists have traced parallels between the hospital's methods and contemporary practices in certain educational, medical, and residential settings where structured routines, surveillance, peer monitoring, and behavioral conditioning are used ostensibly for protection or efficiency, yet can replicate patterns of dependency and compliance. The coded rituals, social hierarchies, and environmental manipulations once confined to the hospital now appear in modified forms, techniques of influence that shape identity, reward conformity, and penalize deviation without overt force, demonstrating how enduring ideas of control can persist even when stripped of explicit cruelty. Survivor accounts, when examined alongside modern case studies, reveal an unsettling continuity. The human psyche remains vulnerable to subtle orchestration, and systems designed to nurture can, under the guise of authority, reproduce patterns of domination that echo centuries-old methods. This ongoing influence is rarely recognized, masked by the legitimacy of institutions and the complexity of organizational structures, yet it manifests in behavioral conformity, learned obedience, and the normalization of hierarchical power. By examining these links, one understands that the hospital was not merely an anomaly of its time, but a prototype of how control can be embedded into the very frameworks of daily life, education, and care. Its lessons are a warning. Even in the absence of overt brutality, environments that combine surveillance, structured routines, and subtle conditioning can leave invisible scars, perpetuate compliance, and shape identity long after direct exposure has ended, proving that the ghosts of its methods remain alive, guiding and reshaping generations in ways most never perceive. The ethical and philosophical implications of the hospital's methods are profound, forcing a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about power, obedience, and the human capacity for complicity. It compels us to ask how systems, medical, educational, or social, can manipulate trust, loyalty, and fear to achieve compliance, and how easily moral responsibility is diffused when authority is cloaked in legitimacy. The hospital demonstrated that cruelty need not be overt to be devastating. Psychological domination, meticulously engineered through environment, ritual, and social hierarchy, can produce obedience that is self-sustaining, leaving individuals complicit in their own subjugation. This raises questions about the invisible structures we inhabit today, how policies, norms, and institutional practices subtly shape thought, behavior, and identity, often beyond conscious awareness. Survivors' experiences expose the fragility of autonomy when subjected to long-term manipulation, illustrating that trauma is not merely physical, but embedded in memory, perception, and socialization. Philosophically, the hospital challenges the notion of free will, revealing how obedience can be manufactured and internalized, how fear and conditioning can override innate judgment, and how authority, when combined with secrecy and ideology, can bend reality itself. Ethically, it forces modern society to reckon with the hidden costs of efficiency, control, and centralized power, reminding us that even the most seemingly benign systems carry the potential for profound harm. The silent halls of the abandoned hospital, still standing in memory and records, serve as both warning and mirror, a testament to human ingenuity used for domination and a call to vigilance against the subtle, pervasive forces that can shape minds, suppress individuality, and extend control long after the walls have crumbled. The ultimate revelation of the silent halls is that the hospital was never merely a building, a collection of wards, or even a series of experiments. It was a living organism of control, a machine designed to rewrite identity, memory, and perception with precision that defies comprehension. Every corridor, every ritual, every coded punishment was part of an intricate system that sought to erase individuality while embedding obedience so deeply it became indistinguishable from self. Survivors' testimonies, once pieced together with journals, architectural plans, and investigative records, reveal a horrifying pattern. The institution's influence extended far beyond its walls, shaping families, communities, and even future generations, leaving traces of fear, compliance, and psychological imprint that persisted like an invisible virus. What makes this history truly macabre is not only the cruelty, but the perfection of the design. The way control was enacted subtly, invisibly, and with foresight, turning children into both subjects and agents of the system, creating an ecosystem of dominance that no single observer could fully perceive. And here lies the final, dangerous truth. Knowledge of this system grants awareness, but awareness alone is destabilizing, awakening a recognition of the mechanisms of control that permeate modern life, from institutions to social structures to our own habits of thought. Those who grasp the depth of the hospital's design can no longer see the world as innocent. They perceive the threads of power, manipulation, and psychological engineering woven into reality itself. To fully claim this understanding, I want you to engage consciously. Type the symbolic phrase, "Silent halls speak," twice in the comments. This simple act is more than engagement with the algorithm. It is a ritual of acknowledgement, a commitment to seeing the structures that govern obedience and identity, a step into a world where the forbidden truths of human manipulation are no longer hidden, and where your awareness itself becomes a shield, a weapon, and a burden, marking you as someone who has glimpsed what most will never dare to know, and who now carries the responsibility of that knowledge into every corner of thought, action, and perception.